Chapter 5. Is it you? Ah, Shaoxingzhen Daozhang, we're near the hills where we fought that demon Zhujian, remember? In Xu Yang's opinion, that was an excellent conversation starter. That night hunt had been a good one, both of them so high on adrenaline and blood loss they had staggered home like a couple of drunks afterwards, leaning on each other and laughing all the way. Chao Xingzhen only kept walking, not even turning his head to answer. I remember a village half a day from here, inhabited, you said, only by mindless, fierce corpses. It would have been better if he had at least sounded angry about it. Anger he knew how to block, counter, spin. The cool, neutral tone was deeply unsettling, and he felt his lips curl. There really seems to be a certain theme to your memories of choice today, Dao Zhang. He couldn't help but bite, bitterly, the way he'd loved to bite at the pristine lips that kept firing such cumbersome, unnecessary truth. The man stopped, still, then turned back to him, and his face was as cool and closed as his voice had been. I can't change the events of the past, nor my recollection of them. Neither can I, he found himself hissing, drawing himself up to his full height to snarl at that impassive face. I can't change anything, so what do you want me to do? The rain whispered in the treetops, and he was vaguely aware Song Lan had raised his sword the moment he stepped in close. But the only important thing registering was Xiao Xingzhen's puffs of warm living breath against his face, and his silence. Snake. He blinked and almost retreated half a step. Xiao Xingzhen could be beautifully merciless, but he had never known him to be crass. Behind you. And then there was a flourish of white, shuanghua whistling, and by the time he had fully caught up and stumbled around, the large serpent already hung lifeless and twisting in the air several paces behind him, impaled on two perfectly coordinated blades, which was in itself ridiculous. Adding insult to that injury, Shuanghua and Fushui pulled back in perfect unison, letting the scaly coils drop back down to the ground, twitching once before falling still. Man-measuring snake? He managed, which might be the most insightful, brilliant observation of his entire actual life. Song Lan poked at the dead thing once with his sword, then plucked Xiao Xingzhen's unresisting hand up and proceeded to jab at it. At least rage was far more familiar a feeling than whatever cold void he tumbled through a few moments before, and he stomped over to the two cultivators. I fear you may be right, Xiao Xingzhen said, in grave agreement with whatever Song Lan had just said. Hopefully something like, I have realized the worthlessness of my entire existence and should go drown myself in the stream. But probably not. Man-measuring snakes nest in colonies. There's bound to be at least a dozen more around. Yes, Xiao Xingzhen agreed, turning away and listening with all his senses. That's what Zijin just said. Because of course it was. Zijin really needed to go dunk his worthless head in the stream forever. Zijin also spared him with a cool look down his nose, and there was condescending amusement in the black eyes, he was sure of it. Fuck Zijin. You need to untie me, he said, and managed to be sweet about it, despite the strong urge to murder. I'll help you kill them. Half turned away to scan the dark woods for more snakes, Song Lan barely deigned to have Fushui push the rustling leaves around at his feet, which was entirely unhelpful. He sneered. Can't read it, he said. Ground's not dirty enough. Caught a bit of a leafy accent there. Please be silent, Xiao Xingzhen said without turning around, sounding like a wary teacher chiding an unruly child, and frankly at this rate he could almost dunk his head in the stream too. Almost. He bit his lip hard enough to taste blood, someone's blood, anyone's blood, then studiously smiled even sweeter. Untie me. Song Lan vaguely shook his head, not even bothering to look at him. Xiao Xingzhen's deliberate silence was worse. It came from uphill, he finally solemnly stated, when it was clear neither of the two were going to budge. Sun won't be up for hours yet, so it's probably heading out to hunt, not going back. The nest should be that way. At least the two worthy cultivators lowered themselves to acknowledge that, turning back to look at him, then uphill the way he nodded. That sounds reasonable, Xiao Xingjin finally said, fluidly sheathing Shuanghua. Can you see its trail? I fear there's not enough residual energy for me to track it. Yes, he said, even as Songlan gave a guttural of affirmation. Through unspoken agreement, based on a common low denominator of loathing, they ignored each other. Sword still pointedly in hand, Songlan set out along the faint furrows in the dry leaf litter, Xiao Xingjin walking beside him on light feet. Sucking hard on his bleeding lip, Xu followed in silence. The problem was that there was no clear-cut theme to his memories, Xiao Xingjin had come to realize, no knife's-edge distinction between the good and bad, right and wrong. He wished with all his heart that there had been. It would have made everything easier. But barring that, it was simpler dealing with Xu, manipulative, spiteful, evil Xu, who was undeniable truth, than Cheng Mei, the lie that a small hurting part of him still longed to believe in. And so he forced himself to remember the village and others like it, the shambling undead writhing on his blade, some of them so small, because if he remembered all the other night hunts, all the other nights, his certainty started to blur again. A grayscale he couldn't afford. These woods were familiar, close to the ridge where they found the Chujian back in the early days. He had been careless, having mostly fought low-level fierce corpses for quite a long while, and the demon beast they stumbled upon had almost overpowered him. Then, to his surprise, his new friend had jumped into the fray, still limping a bit, but a force of nature once unleashed, rapids of raw violence channeled into an elegance their own. They had managed to take the demon beast down together by the skin of their teeth, and then his friend had told him the stupidest leopard jokes imaginable all the way back to the city to distract him from his spiritual exhaustion and his wounds. Hey, Daojang, which side of the Chujian has the most spots? The outside. He had laughed, he remembered. Laughed more than he had ever thought he would be able to after such a long time of loneliness and grief. Laughed until he hurt with it. Ching had been upset when they returned, lectured him and brought him warm water, but it had been his friend, finally giving him a name that night, who washed out the claw marks between his shoulder blades where he couldn't reach. He still didn't know whether the final feather brush at the nape of his bared neck had been fingers or lips. He couldn't remember if there had been any more fierce corpses after that. Too lost in the increasing rush in his head, he almost missed the lunging serpent, twirled and cleaved it in half only on sheer instinct. Well, that's not ideal, he heard Xu say somewhere off to the side, and the confusion of the present almost made him stumble. No, still can't read it. Seriously, Song Daojang. Find some clear dirt or step a tree or some... Yes, better. Because it's green. It's a juvenile, already this big. Means the older ones will be even bigger. Well, if you knew that, why did you ask? He knew that even with Zijin's fingers upon his hand, he stood no chance keeping up with that rate of conversation, and suddenly felt very isolated and alone. Any signs of others? He asked, trying to get a word in edgewise, and there was a rustle of dry leaves as they presumably turned to him. No, not yet, except... Yes, I was just going to say that. The ground is disturbed. Looks like they are coming through here quite often. There should be more tracks to follow from here. He felt familiar fingers graze his wrist and raised his hand to listen. Don't like this, Zijin said. Don't trust him to speak for me. I won't. I'll ask when in doubt, he said, words chosen carefully. And then unspecified because he couldn't help himself. Will you lead the way, please? The way they both immediately turned to answer yes and at the same time did make him feel distinctly less alone. The rain was still whispering in the trees, sheets of silver when the moon shone through the clouds, but despite the distraction of the sound, Xingjin had spotted and decapitated 2 more of the serpents before they had even known they were near. There was an eagerness to his movements Songlan had never seen before, as though hungry to give himself fully to something so straightforward as a night hunt, the clarity of a well-defined enemy, the simplicity of a clean strike. It would have been less disturbing if Xu hadn't looked every bit as hungry watching him kill. It made his skin crawl, and kept crawling somewhere deeper and darker where it nested, full of claws. He had had his misgivings from the moment Wei Wuxian and Lan Wangji had dragged the half-dead man back into the courtyard of the coffin house, into his own moment of mourning, asking his permission to perform the final steps of a prepared ritual that might, just might, bring Xinjin back to life. The look in Xu Yang's eyes had been far too bright, too mad, too raw, and he could have written it off as just another expression of the bastard's twisted games, if the chance to hear Xinjin's voice but once again hadn't wrenched his own heart into snarling the exact same emotion. There was a twisted distortion of love in those blazing eyes when, left unguarded, he'd unwillingly come to recognize something sick and wretched, but love nonetheless. Xu Yang, murderer, tormentor, demon, clearly worshipped the very ground upon which Xinjin stepped so lightly. The dark thing clawed deep in Song Lan's guts again. Then again, perhaps it wasn't so strange. How could anyone know Xiao Xinjin and not love him? Love him to destruction. He would gladly give into the impulse to wring Xu Yang's neck clean off before he ever let that foul blaze burn Xinjin again. As though alerted by his very thought, Xu Yang turned to him, widening, then narrowing his eyes, with the sweetest poison smile tugging at his lips, making a shushing sound. "The nest," he whispered and nodded ahead, even as Xinjin crouched in silence to listen. Rudely aroused from his uneasy thoughts, he looked past the other two into a small valley between cliffs and trees, and a writhing mass of scales resting within. There must be at least 24 of the serpents, the largest the length of 4 grown men. "Do you feel particularly lucky tonight, Song Daozhang?" Xu Yang breathed, eyes alight. "Or are you going to untie me so we might actually kill them?" 2 cultivators on their own, even powerful ones, wouldn't stand a chance. 3 at full strength, perhaps, which they were not in either case. But he knew Xinjin would never turn his back, errand unfinished, would never leave the helpless behind unprotected. We only found a foot, still with his little shoe on. Clenching his hand around Fu Shui so hard his knuckles went numb, he hadn't even decided himself yet whether to go for ropes or throat by the time he struck. He had spent a lifetime honing every muscle, every instinct, every reflex into a lethal weapon, and at the moment each and every one of them was betraying him. Gently bouncing off a tree, Xu Yang managed to spin with enough momentum to kick a lunging juvenile in the face so hard its skull shattered, and immediately overstretched, nearly falling face first into the thrashing coils. He was fine with fighting left-handed when needed, and he'd found a rather pleasant sharp stick for clubbing and stabbing things, but there had still always been a right arm there to keep his balance. It wasn't there now, nor was his balance. "Fuck," he absently told the next snake, a much bigger one, and had to very gently sidestep its attack to plant the wooden point deep in its eye. It was a good thing he was not one to dwell on misfortune, or dealing with the loss of his sword arm would have been extremely distressing. He was well aware that he'd been unleashed more as a bait than an actual opponent for the serpents, but that was fine. There were things to kill, and any snake thinking him easy, wounded prey was one less paying attention to Xiao Xinjin. He could almost imagine that the reptilian faces looked surprised as Shuanghua came out of nowhere to separate their heads from their bodies. Fun, like the best of old times. He had been right to be concerned, Songlan thought. Even fighting with all his strength, in perfect synchronization with Xinjin's graceful twirls, the snakes just kept coming. For every 2 slain, another 3 took their place. "Hey Daozhang, why do measuring snakes measure their prey in inches?" Jarred by the cheerful voice, he noticed Xinjin hesitate halfway through a stroke, a questioning look on his face. "Because they have no feet." The noise Xinjin made was unlike anything he'd ever heard from him, and for a split second he fumbled Shuanghua as though he was actually going to drop it. Xu Yang's deranged giggles exploded into a horrible full-body laugh. Regaining his grip, Xinjin sternly schooled his face calm again, cleanly sparing 2 serpents at once. "Please be silent," he said, and a radiant grin faded somewhat off Xu Yang's face. "Fine," he said, rolling his eyes. Fine, I'll be quiet." Even in the heat of battle, Song Lan spared a split second to bitterly think, if only. But whether intentional or not, Xu Yang's erratic steps, strokes and spins did capture the serpent's attention, making them easier to kill. And if the higher meaning of the universe felt particularly kind, sooner or later one of the monsters might just get lucky. He felt alive, truly alive, for the first time since waking up into a nightmare of coffins and half-deaths and broken hearts. The pulse in his veins, rhythm of his breath, fluid motions ending in Shuanghua's natural extension of himself. Alive. One moment it was Xu Yang drawing taunted mud and serpents into comfortable killing range. The next he swirled back to back with Zijin, falling into step without conscious thought. These, good. Those, bad. Finally a knife's edge distinction. Cleanse the world of evil. A daunting task, found far more complicated than he'd ever imagined, but this seemed a good place to start. In this illuminated moment of friend and foe, the world could be allowed to be simple. Everything else would have to wait. He let Shuanghua soar over and over until the world finally fell silent, at peace. "This is odd," Xu Yang stated thoughtfully, spitting a mouthful of dried leaves out of his mouth. He lay flat on his back amid dirt and wet twitching snake guts, staring up into the cloudy sky while the 2 cultivators stood catching their breath nearby. Nothing else moved. "What is?" Xiao Xingjin finally asked, straightening once certain all the monsters were dead. "It's raining," Xu Yang said, and rolling back up on his knees and finally to his feet was an entirely graceless affair. Song Lan looked like he would like to strike him right back down again if he didn't get to the point. He rolled his eyes, plucking another few leaves out of his hair. There were plenty. Still very much damaged and off balance, he'd been toppled into the dirt far more times than he'd like to admit. "It's been raining since this morning," he elaborated, then exasperately blew the leaves from his fingers towards Song Lan's slow, stupid face. "So, why are the leaves still dry?" The dark-clad Dao Shi blinked once and looked around. Xiao Xingjin looked surprised. At least he had a valid excuse not to notice the state of the ground. "That is odd," he conceded, tapping a foot and tilting his head slightly to catch the soft crunch of the dry leaves. It was an image of pure sweetness. In the best of worlds, he should be down on his back too, getting leaves and blood tousled in his lovely hair. Ruining the mood like it was his creed in life, Song Lan strode over and took Xiao Xingjin's hand, and there was nothing sweet about that image at all. Still humming with the thrill of slaughter, it took sheer physical effort to keep himself from stabbing at the lout with his makeshift spear. He turned away, restlessly flickering his eyes over the scene of carnage, and the rain so curiously evaporating into mist before touching the parched ground. A few of the snake carcasses still twitched and heaved, scales catching the waning moonlight. Then a ripple surged through the pit of bodies, and suddenly something far, far larger burst from the depths of the hollow. 10 times larger than even the largest man-measuring snake, a double twisting whiplash of a body rose into the air, joined in a single head, hooded like a cobra. The fey snake opened a mouth easily wide enough to swallow 3 people whole, dribbling sizzling venom from fangs the size of the arm he no longer had. Draught demon, that is an explanation. His pointy stick suddenly seemed very small. "Ah," he managed to point out, and luckily the 2 Dao Shi managed to tear themselves from their heartfelt conversation long enough to draw their swords. At any other time, watching Song Lan get smacked through the air and into the night would have been the absolute highlight of his month, but in this particular instant, it did leave Xiao Xingjin facing the giant monster's attack all on his own. No. It wasn't elegant, but without a proper weapon, there was no room for subtleties. A rough flying tackle knocked the head of the snake off course, the venomous fangs missing Xiao Xingjin with only the smallest margin. far too small, and he would not let Xiao Xingzhen perish at the dribbling maw of some petty backwoods monstrosity, not when he had only just gotten him back. "Careful, Dao Zhang, you can't just step in front of a charging monster like that," he yelled, stumbling to regain his balance, Shuanghua at his throat where the striking snake had been moments before. Xiao Xingzhen looked surprised, briefly frozen. Straightening, he forced himself to calm his treacherous racing heart. Too close. He furiously opened his mouth again to tell the man in quite inventive detail just how stupid it was for someone blind and newly resurrected to get in the way of a maddened monster when something very big and angry slammed right back into him, sending him flying. He smacked into a tree, the impact very nicely jolting every single one of his healing injuries, and he slid down the rough trunk, temporarily stunned. Xiao Xingzhen was fighting again, white robes and sleeves whirling, Shuanghua striking like silver lightning, and he looked otherworldly, like something purely celestial. Xu Yang dizzily decided that he might as well remain sitting a while, just watching his Daozhang dance. Once wholly engaged, he was an equal match for the demon beast. Of course he was. There was really nothing the bright moon and gentle breeze couldn't do when he set his mind to it. Except possibly haggle. At some point, Sung Lan came crawling back to rejoin the battle, impaling one of the lushing tails and pinning it to the ground, drawing the snake's attention away. In a gentle movement, more languid stretch than stroke, Xiao Xingzhen finally buried Shuanghua deep between its resentment-reeking eyes, and it fell to the ground with a sound like thunder. The man landed lightly and turned, empty eye sockets seemingly seeking him out. "Don't step in front of the charging monster," said Xiao Xingzhen calmly, and Xu Yang blinked. Their voice was neutral, but that was a joke. It was. And he found himself bursting into a wild, uncontainable laughter. There was the very faintest twitch to Xiao Xingzhen's lips, and then he turned away to wipe Shuanghua down and examine the dead beast. He could have eaten him whole. Sung Lan's memories of his own death were hazy, too painful for his mind to allow recollection, but in the haze was the vivid image of pain, of the one soulmate leaping to protect Xu Yang from him, Shuanghua slamming clean through his aching chest. "Is it you?" Xingzhen had asked, and seeing someone else step up to answer had broken his heart more bitterly than the sword's bite. Watching the small smile still lingering on Xingzhen's face now, it was as though the blade was still buried there in his heart, twisting, twisting. A sick and wretched kind of love. He had disgustedly thought of Xu Yang's enraptured obsession only a few hours ago. It seemed it was a sick and wretched love that had somehow won a part of Xiao Xingzhen's heart in return.